తర్వాత నాకు ఇది కావాలి పాయింట్ ఇది కదా good morning, dear students. Last week we have dealt with the anatomy of the nasal cavity, the structure, how the structure is made by various bones of the skull, starting from the nasal bones, the frontal bones, the ethmoid bones, the lacrimal bone, the maxilla, the palatine bone, and the posteriorly you have the sphenoid medial plates of the pterygoid, and how the nasal chamber, just like a matchbox, has got a roof, a floor, anterior and posterior limits, the lateral wall and the medial wall. So that forms the chamber of the nasal cavity, and the nasal cavity is divided into two by a midline septum. So these are the various bones which are forming this nasal cavity, and we have also seen that the nasal cavity is divided into spaces by three projections which are coming from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. These are nothing but the turbinates, which are otherwise called concave. There are three in number: the inferior, the middle, and the superior concave. So these are the three projections which are coming from the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, which divide the nasal cavity, the chamber, into inferior meatus, the middle meatus, and superior meatus, and above that you have the sphenoethmoidal braces. And we have also seen that the nasal cavity starts anteriorly with the nasal apertures, which are called anterior nares, and nasal cavity ends posteriorly by the openings of this nasal cavity, which are called posterior nares, otherwise called echoidae, which lead into a space called the nasopharynx, and this nasopharynx, which is in continuity with the oropharynx and further down. Now the nasal cavity forms the upper respiratory tract, the beginning of the respiratory tract. As you know, the respiratory tract consists of the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, the hypopharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the two bronchi, and the bronchopulmonary segments, bronchi and bronchioles, and ultimately the alveoli. This is the basic structure of the respiratory system, and the nose and the paranasal sinuses are the ones which form the upper respiratory tract. Now, so the various bones we have seen which form the basic structure of the nasal cavity. Then we go to the various linings of the nasal cavity. The anterior, there are three kinds of linings. The anterior part of the nasal cavity, which is lined by skin, is called the vestibule, where you have the hairs which are called vibrissae. Then you have the major part of the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses together are covered by a kind of a mucous membrane, which is simply called as the respiratory epithelium, or otherwise described as pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And the third type of mucous membrane that is present is the olfactory mucous membrane. So these are the three different types of linings. The nasal vestibule by the skin, the major part of the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinus by the respiratory epithelium, which is otherwise called the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and at the superior turbinate and above, that is up to the roof of the nasal cavity, and the corresponding area on the septum forms the olfactory mucous membrane. So these are the three different kinds of linings that we have seen. And we have also seen the blood supply of the nasal cavity is by both the systems, the external carotid and the internal carotid system. From the internal carotid system, the blood vessels which supply the anterior part of the nasal septum and the roof here are the anterior and posterior ethmoidal arteries and corresponding veins, whereas the major part of the blood supply is coming from the external carotid system in the form of the maxillary artery, which comes into the sphenopalatine foramina and then comes into the nasal cavity and then supplies the entire lateral wall of the nasal cavity and also the nasal septum. And anteriorly you have the facial artery, which is supplied, and of course the palatine arteries. So these are the various arteries with their corresponding venous components which supply the nasal cavity. Now, when you take up the structure of the blood supply, particularly in the nasal cavity, in the inferior turbinates, there is a system called venous sinusoids, which is something like the erectile tissue. So these sinusoids, I'll tell you about these sinusoids, how they are formed, and they have an important role to play. And apart from that, the structure, you have seen various bones, you have seen how the nasal cavity is divided into the various, by the meatai, by the various turbinates, and the various kinds of linings that are lining. Then you go into the special, I'll tell you about the special venous sinusoids that the kind of a blood system, erectile tissue that is present in the inferior turbinate. Then we go to the nervous system, and when we go into the nervous system, you have the nerves, which the general somatosensory nerves from the ophthalmic as well as the maxillary divisions. That is as far as the anterior ethmoidal nerves. And then you have the nerves, the maxillary division, maxillary nerve, and the ophthalmic divisions of they are the general somatosensory. Now there is a ganglion called the sphenopalatine ganglion, which is responsible to host the parasympathetic and sympathetic. Now the parasympathetic fibers to this ganglion come from the superior salivatory nucleus in the pons and the medulla, and from there they travel along with the facial nerve. Then you have the geniculate ganglion, where the greatest superficial petrosal nerve is the major branch which comes out of that, and that in turn travels in the intracranium and ultimately comes into the sphenopalatine area, and which is joined by, which carries the parasympathetic fibers. That's called greater petrosal nerve, and it is joined by another nerve which carries the sympathetic plexus around the carotid artery, which is called the deep petrosal nerve. These two petrosal nerves, greater and deep petrosal nerve, they form and travel in a canal called the median nerve. Now this joins the sphenopalatine ganglion, and from there the branches which go are the ones which supply the secretomotor fibers. Secretomotor fibers to the glands, the mucous glands that are present, and also supply the help in the release of these sphincters, and then release the blood or the arterioles and release the blood into the venous sinusoids. So this is called the parasympathetic outflow, wherein there is increased blood supply and there is engorgement of these erectile tissue in the inferior turbinate area particularly. Now we'll come to that. I'll try to explain to you how it happens. Then, so the structure, the various, the mucus lining, and also the various blood vessels and peculiarity of the inferior turbinate blood, the venous sinusoids. Then the nerve supply, the sensory supply, and of course the parasympathetic, sympathetic outflow. And the third one is the olfactory area, where you have the olfactory epithelium, uroepithelium, which is situated, as I told you, at the roof level, almost above the superior turbinate and the corresponding area onto the septum. Now, through which in the roof, we have seen earlier that the roof is formed by the cribriform plate of the ethmoid, where are small sieve-like openings through which the nasal olfactory nerves travel to the olfactory bulb. We'll come to that later in detail. So, with this brief anatomy, recapitulating the anatomy and the linings, the blood supply, and the various nerves, we go to the functions of the nasal cavity. So basically, the functions of the nasal cavity are breathing. Some people have given it as respiration, but breathing is the correct word, because the respiration is defined as the exchange of gases. So exchange of gases do not take place in the nasal cavity here. It is only a passage for the nasal, the air from the atmosphere going into the nasal cavity, and then further down into the nasopharynx, and then into the larynx, and then into the lungs. And from the lungs, the air is expelled out through the nasal cavity. So the breathing consists of two components. One is the inspiration, the other one is the expiration. Now we'll see how this happens. Now there are various other functions that have been listed here. These are the functions of the nose, and these are the functions of the nasal cavity. We'll try to go into detail one after the other and try to see how the functions of the nasal cavity are being done or performed. Yeah. So this is the basic Air currents from the anterior nares travel into the nasal cavity, and there is a curve, and the major part of the wave travels through the middle meatus area. Okay, and this is called the lamellar flow. It's called the lamellar flow. That is, air from the anterior nares travels like that and ultimately come out through the posterior choanae and then go into the nasopharynx. This is called the lamellar flow. Now, that is as far as the inspiration is concerned. When you go to the expiration part of it, the expiration, that is the air that is coming from the lungs, comes into the larynx and then into the oropharynx, from the oropharynx into nasopharynx. From there it is into the choana. From there you have the air coming out and being expelled through the anterior nares. This is the expiratory. Now in the expiratory phase, what happens is the air that is coming into the nasal cavity, you have these turbinates which are little projections which are coming into the nasal cavity, projecting. They also to some extent obstruct the clean outflow of the nasal air, and in the anterior part of the nasal cavity, you will see a constricted area, and which is the narrowest part of the nasal cavity, constricted part, and this is the area which is called the nasal valve. If you try to examine your nose and look into the mirror, you will see that the nasal cavity, the nasal bones and the cartilage. Last time we have studied how the upper alar cartilage and the lower alar cartilage, and the junction between the upper and the lower alar cartilage, there is a kind of a depression there. Now this depression on the outside corresponds to a kind of a projection in the nasal cavity, and that along with the anterior end of the inferior turbinate, on the lateral side, and on the medial side you have the nasal septum. I'll just try to show you nasal valve. This is what it is. This is the nasal bone, upper alar cartilages and the lower alar cartilages. Okay, and this is the area where there is a small depression, as you can see yourself or in a mirror, or you can see the others. There is a depression there which produces a kind of a small projection into the nasal cavity. And as I said, the anterior end of the inferior turbinate on the lateral side, and on the medial side you have the septum. So this forms the nasal valve. This is the narrowest part of the nasal cavity, and so as the air being exhaled or in the expiration part, in the expiration, because of this obstruction, there is some of the air which is traveling goes backwards and produces kind of eddy currents. These are called the eddy currents. The significance of these eddy currents, how they affect the ventilation of the nasal sinuses, we will see later. And so these are the eddy currents that are formed. And then, as I was telling you about the erectile tissue, the venous plexus that is present prominently in the inferior turbinate, as we see, the arteries usually divide into the arterioles, and the arterioles further divide into small capillaries, and these small capillaries on the arterial end, and the capillaries, they form the capillaries. This happens in the tissues. So the capillaries, venous end, and they usually form a vein, and that is how the system usually works in other places. But in the nasal cavity, as I told you, the arteries sometimes directly open into spaces which are called the sinusoids, which are empty spaces, but they can get filled up into these. The blood can pool within a fraction of a second with a very short interval, because the arteries, the arterioles, normally do not allow the blood to flow into the sinusoids, and they are guarded by a physiological sphincter which is controlled by the parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. Parasympathetic is the one which dilates them, opens them, and also the various amines, vasoactive amines like the histamine and serotonin. So when they can also open up this physiological sphincter and suddenly flood the entire venous sinusoids, and within very short period the entire turbinate gets engorged with blood. Now there is a purpose for that. We'll go into that later. And so basically the first point that we have discussed is the breathing in and breathing out, inspiration and expiration. And we have seen the nasal valve and the blood vessels peculiar to the inferior turbinate area. Then we go into a situation which is called the nasal cycle. This was described where they found that both the nostrils do not function at the same time. One side of the nose is totally blocked, and the other functions normally. And after 2 to 12 hours, usually, the other sinus, the other nasal cavity opens up, and the first nasal cavity or the previous one gets blocked. So it's a kind of a shift kind of a system that is happening in the nasal cavities, and these are regulated by the autonomic nervous system. As I said, the sphenopalatine ganglion, how the fibers, the fibers come from the superior salivatory nucleus, how they have the influence on the increasing the secretions as well as releasing the physiological sphincter of the arterioles and flooding the venous sinusoids. So that is as far as the nasal cycle is concerned, and this usually lasts between 2 and 12 hours, but the average being 2 to 4 hours. And this is what happens, and if you observe, you'll be able to demonstrate, particularly the adults, 80% of the adults, you'll be able to assess. And what really happens during this nasal cycle is one side of the nasal cavity is totally free, and whereas the other side there is engorgement of the venous sinuses, there is some kind of a edema, there is an exudation. Now, basic function of this nasal cycle, it is interpreted that the blood usually pools into this area. From there is a kind of a exudate that comes, and this exudate is the one which maintains the water content or humidification of the nasal cavity. That's one. And it also contains, the exudate contains various lysozymes and the immunoglobulins, which are protective in function. So that is the basic function of this nasal cycle. During the blockage, these are the things that happen, whereas the other nasal cavity is promptly working with a full efficiency. So that is as far as the nasal cycle is concerned and its significance. Now there are certain factors which modify the nasal cycle: the temperature, the head position, the humidity, the physical activity, exercising, the emotional, psychological hypothyroidism, and the various drugs which act on the nasal mucosa. So these are the this is about the nasal cycle. So that is the first heading that we have discussed. Then we go to another important function which is called the air conditioning. Air conditioning is usually, in our countries, we usually use air condition to cool our either the car or the household. Whereas in the cold countries, it is the reverse, where the air is from the cold air is heated and it comes. So air conditioning basically means that the temperature control, so that whatever the air that we breathe in, maybe 0 degrees centigrade to 40 or 50 degrees centigrade. And there are some people who work in the kitchens, much more higher temperatures. So the body has to regulate the temperature, and as it passes through the nasal cavity, in order to satisfy certain functional needs, the temperature control. The body works optimum at the 37 degrees is the one, 32 to 40 degrees. Usually that is the temperature at which the cilia particularly, there are two things that we need to consider: the temperature and the humidification. These are the two factors which control the movement of the ciliary activity. If there is high temperature or low temperature, that's very cool, the ciliary action comes down. We'll come to that later. Humidification also similarly, when there is excess of humidification or dry air, the ciliary movement comes down. So it is required that air has to be brought to the almost near to the body temperature, and as the air passes through, as we have seen, the nasal cavity with its projections, the turbinates, the surface area of the mucous membrane is increased, and so you have the blood which is in the submucosal layer, which comes in contact with the air that is passing through and brings that air to almost body temperature, and this takes place at a very rapid pace, almost 1/4 of a second. Then humidification is usually done by, there are secretions, nasal secretions, which are serous and mucoid secretions, and I think I showed you the mucous membrane. This is the mucous membrane. This is called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and you have these serous and mucus producing glands here, and these are the nasal the cells which contain the cilia, and the mucus that is being produced is of two different varieties. One is called the solve, the other one is the gel, which is more thick. The thicker one is the outside, whereas the solve is the deeper layer. So we will come to the function of the cilia a little later, but this is what happens. So for the optimal function of the nasal cavity, of the ciliary clearance, the temperature and humidification are the very important factors. So the nose does this function, and the humidification usually is done by the water that comes from the serous glands, and additional water comes from the expired air, as you know, from the larynx, as it comes into the pharynx, the oral cavity, all that saliva, and then that mixes, and the air that is expelled out contains a lot of moisture that is added to this. And the third one is the nasolacrimal duct, which is the duct which there is a continuous secretion of the tears which are drained into the inferior meatus via the nasolacrimal apparatus and the nasolacrimal duct. And so they are the ones which supply the humidity. So that is as far as the air conditioning, that means temperature regulation and the humidification. So that is how the nose functions. Then we go into the important function again, which is called the protection of the lower airway. And as we know, the air that we breathe in consists of various particulate matter, the bacteria, the virus, and so or the irritant fumes. So to some extent, the particulate matter, which are big, more than the 3 micrometers, are trapped by the nasal vibrissae. And where are these nasal vibrissae? They are present in the anterior part of the nasal cavity, which is called the nasal vestibule. So they are hairs. So they are the ones which filter. That is the first level. Then the smaller particles, which are 0.5 microns, they usually, as they are traveling, they are trapped by the mucus. And once this, see, these are the particles. These are the particles where they get adherent to the mucus layer of the nasal cavity, and we'll go to the function of the cilia. Now, cilia, as you know, are the ones which have 2 kinds of movements. One is a fast component, and the other one is the slow recovery phase. This is how it is described. In the nasal cavity, the mucociliary activity is from the front backwards. From the front backwards. That means the mucus that is being produced anteriorly goes into the choangle, and from there this mucus is going into the nasopharynx, from there into the oropharynx, and then from the oropharynx into the hypopharynx, and then you swallow. So that is how the mucus is being taken away. The cilia, as I said, are not governed by any of these nervous systems, but they have the intricate mechanism to vibrate, and they usually, normal beat is 17 to 16 hertz at the body temperature. And as we have discussed, the temperature higher or cool temperature is the one which decreases the motility of the cilia. At the same time, the humidity also influences the motility of the cilia. So there is a fast component and a slow component. The fast component is backwards in the nasal cavity, whereas in the lower respiratory tract in the lungs, the ciliary activity is upwards, below upwards. It takes away the secretions from the bronchi and into the trachea, larynx, and then it comes into the hypopharynx, and then you swallow. So this is what happens to the nasal, the mucus. So that is the way in which the mucociliary function helps in trying to take away the small particles which are adherent to the mucus and transports them into the stomach. Okay. Then the other functions are sneezing as some kind of irritant, or there is a foreign body which is trying to enter into the nasal cavity, stimulates, and you have deep inspiration, and suddenly the gush of air is pushed, and that pushes the foreign body out. Then it was also the lysozymes and the immunoglobulins, which to some extent act on the bacteria and the viruses and the interferon, and in the protection of the infections. So this diagram we have understood, and this is something like a conveyor belt, the mucociliary action, and this is how the cilia, the entire mucus blanket, is pushed into the nasal. And for this, they have, as I told you, the factors which influence, decrease the mobility of the atmospheric, absence of humidity, and smoking, and extremes of hypoxia, and some of the drugs. Then we come to the from the nasal cavity. You have these sinuses, which are the cavities which are present in the skull bones, and the paranasal sinuses are divided into the anterior and the posterior groups. The anterior group consists of the frontal sinus, the anterior and middle ethmoidal groups of cells, and then you have the maxillary sinus. These form the anterior group of sinuses, which all of them drain into a space called the meatus, into a small curvilinear depression in the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, which is called the hiatus semilunaris. Then you have the posterior group of sinuses, which are the posterior ethmoidal and the sphenoidal sinuses. Now, the posterior ethmoidal sinuses are the ones which drain into the superior meatus, that is the space between the superior turbinate and the middle turbinate. And the sphenoid sinus drains into the recess called sphenoethmoidal recess. As you know, the middle turbinate and the superior turbinate are parts of the ethmoid bone. So this part is the sphenoethmoidal recess. Ultimately, all these sinuses drain in the anterior and posterior groups of sinuses, and if you take up the sinuses, the mucociliary action or direction is towards the ostium, and so the mucus that is being continuously produced is cleared into the nasal cavity. From there it goes into the nasopharynx and then into the stomach. So that is as far as the mucociliary clearance in the nasal cavity, and most of these the pathophysiology can be easily understood by a simple understanding of the movement of the the cilia and various factors which influence them. And then people have studied in order to know the ciliary action, ciliary movement, by putting saccharin solution on the inferior turbinate, and the normal speed is 5 to 10 millimeters per minute, and the normal time by which the saccharin, that is sweetening agent, and this can be felt when it comes into the nasopharynx and then comes into the oropharynx by the perception of the taste. So it takes roughly about 10 to 20 minutes, and that is how the nasociliary function has been evaluated. Then we go to the ventilation of these sinuses. Sinuses, as you know, are cavities in the skull bone, which are the main content of these sinuses is air-filled cavities, and of course the lining, the pseudocytoid ciliated columnar epithelium, and the mucus is continuously being produced and is sent into the nasal cavity. So these are the outpouches. They are not in direct line with the inspiration expiration as in the nasal cavity, so they are onto the side. Then how do these sinuses have the ventilation for the air? So they found that when the air travels in the nasal cavity, in the lamellar flow, when there is air that is passing rapidly through that narrow canal in passage of the nose, there is a negative pressure that is created in the sinuses, and so the air that is in the sinuses is sucked into the nasal cavities. So during inspiration, the sinuses are, the air from the sinuses is being sucked into the nasal cavity, whereas during the expiration, as I told you, there is a nasal valve which stops the air from and produces the turbulence, and this turbulent air slowly finds the ostia which are present, the openings of the sinuses, and through that the air goes into the sinuses. So this is how air is sucked in and replaced during inspiration and expiration. So that is as far as the the ventilation of the sinus. This is a diagrammatic picture which shows that air, when it's passing through the nasal cavity, produces a negative pressure, and so the air is sucked into the nasal cavity. And during expiration, because there is an obstruction here, and so there are these eddy currents which are passing, and they push the air into the paranasal sinuses. So one of the functions of the nasal cavity is to ventilate the paranasal sinuses. And another function of these nasal cavity is to drain away the secretions which are continuously being secreted, the mucus, from the sinuses. And this is how the various openings that we have mentioned, the anterior and posterior lobes of sinuses, how they open into the middle and superior and sphenoethmoidal recesses, how the mucus comes into the nasal cavity and drain. So that is as far as the paranasal sinuses drainage system is concerned. If you see the mucociliary activity in the sinuses, in the frontal sinuses, usually it is like that. They push through the frontonasal duct into the nasal cavity. This is the maxillary ostium, and so the mucus is set there. If there is a decreased amount of nasociliary activity here, or there is a blockage of the maxillary ostium, and there is accumulation of the sinuses, which leads to, slowly, whenever there is an accumulation, leads into infections, and these infections are the ones which produce the various inflammatory process, further block the passages, and there is infection, which is, the entire thing is filled with pus, which causes acute sinusitis. So the pathophysiology can be easily understood by the understanding of the nasociliary clearance. Now, another important function is the nasal resistance. As I told you, nasal valve which is present in the anterior part of the nasal cavity, which is the one narrowest part of the nasal cavity. So as the air passes, try to come onto the atmosphere, there is obstruction, and so this back pressure that is being maintained is the one which is very important factor which prevents the alveolar collapse. If the entire air escapes, the alveoli collapse, and for them to open up it will be difficult. This you can easily experience when you blow a balloon and then release it. Once the entire balloon gets deflated, for you to blow it again, initially it will be difficult. So this is how the analogy we can give. And alveolar collapse is the one which is prevented by an obstruction here, which produces a positive pressure, and so the alveoli totally do not collapse. So that is the function of the nasal resistance. And this nasal resistance usually partly by the nasal vestibule, nasal valve is the major contribution, as I told you. And the nasal turbinates, the turbinates are the ones which do not allow the air to just pass out just like that. So they are the ones which offer resistance. So these are the three areas which, but the major part is the nasal valve, which prevents the air totally coming out and collapsing the alveoli. So this is another diagrammatic picture of where this is the anterior part of the nasal cavity, the vestibule, and this is the area where you have the nasal valve, that is the inferior turbinate, where the superior ala cartilage, there's a depression somewhere there, and the septum on this side, medial side, they are the ones which form this nasal valve, and of course the turbinates which project also offer some resistance to the air that is coming out. This is as far as, and this is the ostium, the limen nasi. See, that is the area where you have the nasal valve, 1.5 centimeters posterior to the anterior nares. Okay, and this is what we have already discussed: the cartilage, the anterior end of the inferior turbinate, and adjacent nasal septum, and in cross-section airway. That is, and the Cortle's test checks the valve patency. So once again, the same diagram which I have enumerated earlier: the nasal valve, upper and lateral cartilage, and how it produces a kind of a projection here in the nasal cavity, the turbinate, inferior turbinate, and the nasal septum, and that is the nasal valve. So we know the nasal valve and how it functions, the important function of the nasal valve. Then the various factors which increase and decrease the nasal resistance. Then we go to the next topic, which is the vocal resonance. This is particularly by the paranasal sinuses, the paranasal sinuses which are filled with air. So just like a guitar chamber, you have a guitar wherein there is a chamber where the air is the one which vibrates and produces that sound. Without that chamber, the sound is not, it's only, you can only feel the vibrations, but you don't feel you can't hear the sound. So the vocal resonance, that means the basic sound that is produced in the vocal cords is modulated, and the air that is there in the nasal cavity, as it comes from the nasopharynx and into the nasal cavity. So there are certain consonants like these are the ones, unless the air passes through the nasal cavity, you will not be able to produce these. So D nasal voice is seen in there's a block. Usually the same sounds are heard as BDG. Okay, actually they in phonetics usually ABCD in children, for children they teach. We used to learn as ABCD. Now they have phonetics, abacada, that kind of a pronunciation. So that is what happens if the nasal cavity is blocked. Either there is a problem in the nasopharynx or in the nasal cavity itself, where the nasal sinuses, the air and the sound vibrations do not enter into the nasal cavity, and so there is no resonance that is produced, and that is called a condition called rhinolalia clausa. Usually this occurs in conditions where there is a huge adenoids or a mass in the nasopharynx, or the polyps, or obstruction, various kinds of obstructions. So maybe just inflammatory mucus or thickened membrane, mucous membrane. So these are the various conditions where there is air doesn't pass through the nasal cavity, produce rhinolalia clausa. And there is another condition which is called rhinolalia aperta, where too much of air escapes into the nasal cavity. We see in the conditions where there is a palatal paralysis, or sometimes a velopharyngeal insufficiency. Okay? And sometimes when there is a cleft palate, congenital condition, where the air directly goes into the nasal cavity and too much of air into the nasal cavity produces a peculiar kind of a voice which is called rhinolalia aperta. Then we go to the various reflexes that take place in the nasal cavity, and of course once the sneeze reflex is something which we have already established, and the other reflexes are the smell reflex. When you smell nice food, what really happens is the increases the secretion of the saliva, so that the food that you chew nicely becomes into a morsel and then easy to swallow. And of course the gastric juices which are secreted in the stomach are the ones which convert, which digest the food. So that is as far as the nasal smell reflex. And similarly that is the positive aspect. And the nasopulmonary reflex is there, another one which is described. Then we come to the olfactory function. The olfactory, that is sensation of smell. The olfactory area in the nasal cavity is, as we have already discussed, is situated in the almost at the roof level, superior turbinate, and the corresponding area on the septum, and through the cribriform plate, how the nasal the nerves enter into the olfactory bulb. So that is as far as the nasal olfactory area is concerned. Now the olfactory area consists of the basic structure of the olfactory mucous membrane. We will see here. It consists of the olfactory cell, which contain these small cilia, and which are covered by the mucous layer. Then and these olfactory cells are supported by the supporting cells, and then you have these olfactory cells which send their impulses or travel via the cribriform plate and go into the olfactory bulb, which consists of these glomerulus, and from there the impulses are traveling via the mitral cells to the olfactory, from the bulb to the olfactory tract. Okay, this basic structure of the olfactory epithelium you must know. The Bowman's glands is secretory, and the basic olfactory cells with their cilia, and the supporting cells. How they communicate? They travel via the cribriform plate openings and go into the glomerulus. From there, the mitral cells, the olfactory tract. How the tract travels in the anterior cranial fossa. That we will see a little later. This is the basic structure you should understand. Now, for the olfaction to occur, olfaction is usually perceived as a sensation of smell, and the smell usually travels from one place to the other place by what are known as the particles. Olfaction is by the particulate matter. From a flower, you have these various particles, or the odorant particles, which come into the nasal cavity, and they in turn are the ones which the mucous layer, they are the ones they mix with that, and how the olfactory cell, the cilia, kind of an action potential, that is when they are bound there, then the action potential that takes place, and from there the nerve impulses they travel. So that is and usually in a nerve the impulses travel by a wave of depolarization. So there is some kind of a change that happens in the electrolytes, particularly the potassium, the chloride. So basic mechanism is, as we have said, the odorous particles, they travel and then they go to the receptor cells. From there the produce a kind of a permeability. There is a cause the outflow of the potassium and causes depolarization of cells, and that's how the impulse is traveling into the olfactory bulb, and from there the olfactory tract. So that is as far as the basic olfactory function is concerned. Now the olfactory neural pathways, if you see from the nasal cavity, we have seen how it travels through the cribriform blade, the olfactory bulb, and the olfactory tract, and it travels like that and in the anterior cranial fossa, and ultimately flattens a little there, and then there it trifurcates. It becomes flat and trifurcates into the olfactory striae, and these are the ones, these directly go to the olfactory cortex, one track. The other track goes to the olfactory tract. I'll show you the olfactory. Yeah, this is the olfactory cortex that is present in the cerebral hemispheres. This is the somatosensory. This is the vestibular, and that is the auditory, and that's the visual cortex. So the olfactory cortex is present here. So these three branches which I have told you, one of the branches goes into this, and the second branch goes into the hypothalamus, and the third one to the amygdala and the hippocampus. Okay, so this is how the nasal tract neural pathway is seen. Same diagram, once again a different kind of a diagram, but the same mechanism how the impulses travel into the olfactory cortex, and from there secondary cortex and amygdala. So this is basic mechanism through which the odorous particulate matter, how they come in contact with the olfactory cells, and how the impulse is traveling into the cerebral centers. Then olfactory dysfunction usually occurs when there is a conductive loss. Conductive loss in the sense when there is an obstruction. Air has to pass into those areas, because air is the one which takes those particles onto the surface of the olfactory epithelium. So if there is a conductive loss, if there is some kind of a mucus there or a polyp there, air cannot travel into this into the olfactory epithelium area, which is situated almost at the roof level. Then the second one is the sensory neural loss, which is during the neuroepithelium gets damaged, either because of the viral infections or airborne toxins. Then third one is the olfactory neural loss, the CNS damage, the central, the tumors and neurodegenerative disorders. Okay, that is as far as the olfactory nerves and how they carry the impulses, and various factors which are various causes, like the upper respiratory tract viral infections, idiopathic head trauma, obstructive sinonasal disease, how they interfere with the mechanism of the olfaction. Okay, then the different types of dysfunction are usually described as anosmia, is total absence of the olfactory sensation. The hyposmia, that is decreased olfactory sensation, that means only part of the sensation is felt. Parosmias and cocosmia, these are the ones where is an altered sensation, it's a perception of a pleasant odor as unpleasant odor. That is called the parosmia, altered. And phantosmia, where there is no odorous substance there, but you feel olfactory stimulus. Then hyperosmias, increased olfactory sensations. And olfactory agnosia, you are able to find out there is some kind of a smell, but you are not able to identify what is the odor. and various tests are being done, not very significant for the undergraduate at your level, but I'll just briefly, you can just mention, you can listen and then forget. These are the rhinomanometry, where there is an instrument and that is connected to the nasal cavity, and the air is being pumped, and that is as far as the anterior rhinomanometry is concerned. And you pass a catheter inside and measure the pressures posteriorly in the choana. That is called posterior rhinomanometry. And the rhinogram, just like the audiogram that is done, the rhinogram is the one which tells us where exactly is the obstruction. And a major part of the obstruction is at the level of the nasal valve. Nasal valve, which is as we have discussed. Then second is the anterior terminator level. Okay, so that is as far as the air that is passing through the nasal cavity is measured, the pressures. Then this is how it is: acoustic rhinomanometry. Okay, as the air passes through and comes out. So this will be able to give us the information about air going in and coming out, where exactly is the obstruction that is being felt, and that is graphed. So that is called acoustic rhinomanometry. Then we go to the various the functions, olfactory function tests. Usually there are some smelling substances, smell bottles, and the smell identification test. Usually the threshold olfactory measures are also measured, manual and dynamic, and these are the various kinds of flavors that are being perceived by the nasal cavity: the coffee, tomato, banana, apple, various melon and tobacco, vinegar, coconut. So the various flavors that are being described, and basically the function of the nasal cavity as far as the olfaction is concerned is to, when there is a nasal block, to treat the nasal cavity, nasal disease, the upper respiratory tract infections, treatment, old age, counseling, head trauma, smoking, toxin exposure, congenital, and the various kinds which produce hyposmia and anosmia, and the parosmias, okay, which are present in the neurological deficit, and some psychiatric symptoms. Now, basic idea is, if you smell bad smell, just like recently there was a bad smell in the Mumbai, so people become aware that there is some kind of a, they become apprehensive, or they become guarded, and they would like to know where this smoke is coming from, and the Bhopal gas tragedy, So to detect the various kinds of abnormal cells, the olfaction helps, and of course the food enjoyment. You enjoy the various flavors that are the food, and that is as far as the olfaction is concerned. So kindly go through these various factors which I have told you, starting from the functions: breathing, air conditioning, protection, airway, the ventilation, drainages, nasal resistance, vocal resonance, nasal reflexes, olfaction, and how the air conditioning, vocal resonance, and how it lightens the weight of the skull. So these are the functions of the nasal cavity and the paranasal sciences. Right, have a nice time.